Hello, everyone. I'm Jerry Faust, Historic Site Director for Dunbarton House Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us this evening for a panel discussion centering Indigenous voices in historic house museums. We are sharing a Zoom poll right now to ask you some initial questions about your familiarity with the topics we will discuss and the ways you learned about this panel. Okay. Our intentions in hosting this panel have been shaped by our work to reconcile the various histories that are part of the physical and intellectual landscape of Dunbarton House. Built in 1799, Dunbarton House is a federal-style building in the Georgetown neighborhood of Washington, D.C. Today, the Historic House Museum is driven in part, excuse me, by the mission to preserve and enhance our understanding of history in order to form our futures. From a man, when a man named Joseph Nurse purchased the property in 1804, this urban farm and household capitalized on the labor of free, indentured, and enslaved individuals. Fast forward to 1928, when the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America purchased the house and property to open a headquarters and establish a museum, which they opened in 1932 with the mission to promote an understanding of the early history of our nation, the ideals that all people are created equal with rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. As Dunbarton House staff actively researches and uncovers information regarding these histories, we want to be intentional about reconciling that information with the history, or the histories actually, of Native peoples that have suffered near complete erasure from our story in over the 200 years since this house was built. We gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples of the Piscataway, Nagpra, on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home here today. The Piscataway peoples are alive and flourishing today, and we want to recognize their community that has thrived on this land for millennia, along with the elders, both past and present, and future generations. We hope our conversation tonight sparks important actions to take moving forward for us and similar institutions. Additionally, following the program, we will provide resources for you to share, educate yourself and others, and donate to. Now, normally this is where I would ask everyone to please silence your cell phones. You might still want to do that. However, as we navigate the current Zoom existence, we ask that you please keep yourself muted and use the chat function to share your questions, which you can submit throughout the panel discussion. We'll address these questions and pre-submitted questions near the end of our conversations. The panel will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel. Okay, are we getting results here? Place of work or affiliation. Majority of you, 67%, are museum professionals. How did you learn about this program? Majority through listservs or emails at 26%. How familiar are you with decolonial practices? It's multiple choice, obviously. I'm actively educating myself about decolonial practices with most common response, 46%. Very promising. Are you currently involved in decolonial work? 49% say yes, I'm beginning to learn about decolonial practices. I'm in the process of doing this work. Thank you very much for answering the polls. Now I want to recognize the incredible panel that we have speaking with us today. Dr. Miranda Roberts, Heather Bruegl, Cattlin-Legutko, Meghanlata Gupta, Annalisa Heppner, Dr. Noel Lopez. The panelists will introduce themselves following an introduction from our moderator, Dr. Miranda Roberts.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you for those kind remarks and that opening. Hi, everybody. I'm so glad to be able to see you all here today. My name is Dr. Miranda Roberts. I'm an enrolled member of the Yerington Paiute tribe, as well as Chicana. I grew up in Southern California, and right now I am in the homelands of I am in Alaska, the home of, oh my gosh, I just learned it. The Dene, not the Dene, I am so sorry. Oh my gosh. Deny, thank you. My partner just yelled it at me. So then, as well as numerous others, but I am the home of, I live in Chicago, which is home to numerous tribes from across the country, the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, the Kickapoo, so many other, Peoria, Inoka, Sac and Fox. And one thing that I'm very honored to be a proud of, especially here on this panel, is I'm featured in an exhibition that is currently at the Dunbarton House on women in preservation. My work centers on how we make Indigenous voices more central to all of the work that we are doing in these spaces, in museums and historical homes, in archives and libraries and elsewhere. And so my work is dedicated very much to making sure that our voices are heard and respected, as well as that people try to get familiar with our land and our worldviews, which are extensive and that many people may not understand, but that they are able to recognize and start to learn so that way they can better understand the world in which we live in. One thing that I wanted to address with all of you here today was yesterday was informed that the NSCDA would not allow any of their employees to discuss or to give the land acknowledgement that had been established before. That would be the opener to this particular conference. And to me, and we can definitely point you into the resources to people who can give you the background on why that is the case, why that was a decision made. And from what I understand, it's because the council has not made any sort of, they haven't cited or made a judgment on which side they want to do, like fall on or anything like that. And for me, one thing I would like to inform is that the reason we are all here today is to give this institution that is hosting us, as well as others, that you have to give land acknowledgements on behalf of the people whose land that you are living on, but most importantly, that it should be coming from the people who are asking us to participate in this type of conversation. It should not fall on Indigenous people to give a land acknowledgement at all. It needs to come from a group of people, especially like the NSCDA, to acknowledge the reality that unless you're Indigenous, you are a settler on this land, and you may have an affinity for the Revolutionary War, you might have been a part of a founding family. However, Indigenous people have been calling America, as we understand it here today, for generations and centuries and millennia. And we have an understanding of the land and the world in which we live in that is also preordained from our creation stories. And it is essential to understand that with the settlement of colonies, as well as with the settlement of missionaries and traders throughout this entire region, that we have been pushed and siloed and essentially experienced a genocide of the way of life, having been seen as savages and as seen as people who are racially or culturally inferior to people who settled on this land, and who we essentially, a lot of us helped out to survive on this land. And so this land acknowledgement is much more than just saying, thank you, yes, we're here. It's acknowledging on the behalf of an institution that we are on unceded land, probably stolen land, that was taken through means of either army, treaties, establishment, and things like that, which very much so got rid or tried to get rid of numerous amounts of people who had lives, children, families, creations, and different ideas that sustain this land that we are all privileged to live on. And so to not have someone like the Dunbarton House employees or the NSCDA employees, we will be able to say, like, we understand that as settlers, we are learning how to do this work right. And we are learning how and hoping that this is the right step in that direction. To just say, because we haven't taken a position on it, the position, now that you have all invited us here, is recognizing that Indigenous people's voices are the center of these conversations and therefore need to be respected. And I hope that this can be a continual dialogue as we move forward, that the position being Indigenous people are here and have always been here. And that is just the reality of it. So with that, I would like to say, welcome. I will be your moderator. I am here to answer any questions you may have, as well as to just make sure that this conversation goes well, and to just let you all know, I know I might seem aggressive at times or domineering, but that is not the case. I am doing this work with a good heart and love and support for the work and my ancestors as well, who I'm falling into different worlds of love every day, and this work is all with love. So I would like to just go ahead, and I believe I'm getting started with just starting to ask and have the panelists introduce themselves. So I will go ahead and introduce everybody, or everyone will introduce themselves. So we'll start with Heather.
I'm so excited to be here this evening. Thank you for those words, Miranda, regarding the land acknowledgement. I think that's super important to be addressed, so thank you for doing that. My name is Heather Briegle, and I am enrolled citizen of Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, first-line descendant Stockbridge Munsee. I am coming to you from my office, which is located on the reservation, Stockbridge Munsee Reservation in Northeast Wisconsin, which was created by the Treaty of 1856 from lands that were ceded from the Ho-Chunk and Menominee nations. And I'd like to honor them and thank their ancestors for giving my ancestors a place to call home. My people originally come from the Mahikanatik River Valley. You know that as the Hudson River Valley. And we had settlements all along the Mahikanatik, along the river, along the valley, in 6 different states. I am currently serving as the Director of Cultural Affairs for the Stockbridge Munsee community. In addition to that, I'm a historian and a lecturer, and I lecture on Indigenous history, and I find that it's very important to talk about Indigenous history because I feel like it's a history that's often overlooked or maybe talked about in 2 paragraphs or not talked about correctly. And so I really feel that it's my calling and my duty to my ancestors and those in the museum world and the history world to talk about this history. I'm very honored to be part of this panel this evening and hope to bring a lot of light to some issues. And I'm very excited again to be joining Miranda in another panel and to meet my new fellow panelists. I'm excited and hope we can go forth and learn a lot from each other.
Yes, thank you so much, Heather. Let's go ahead and go to Meghanlata.
Gwach. Ani Bojo, Meghanlata Alexandra Gupta, and Indigenous Mikanak Dodam, Bawatang and Donjaba, Michigaming Ninda, New Haven Ninda. Hello, everyone. That was a traditional greeting in Ojibwe-Moan. My name is Meghanlata Gupta. Megan or Meghanlata, both are good. I am a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians, which is in the UP of Michigan. And I'm in Turtle Clan. And yeah, I am currently, I feel like my background, sorry, it's a little dim. I'm currently in my dorm room because I'm finishing up my senior year here at Yale. And so here at Yale, I'm working on a variety of different things, but I'm particularly very interested in the intersections of journalism, history, and education. I founded and currently edit a digital news organization called Indigenizing the News, which is really dedicated to increasing coverage of Native American communities, of Indian country, and also Indigenous communities more globally as well. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from, and really hope to, learn from my fellow panelists. I'm very excited to be here and very grateful. And yeah, a lot of my work, as both of my fellow panelists have said previously, I mean, I completely agree, is all to honor my ancestors, people who came before me, who, persisted and passed down our stories and our cultures despite facing centuries of, colonialism and oppression and struggle. And I feel incredibly lucky that I get to study these things and I get to share these things and be in these spaces. So with that, thank you all for being here, and I'm really excited to see where this goes.
Thank you so much, Aho. Let's say Annalisa.
Hi, everyone. I'm Annalisa Heppner. I am here in my home office in Narragansett Territory in Providence, Rhode Island. I work at Brown University as the Circumpolar Laboratory Inventory Project Manager, which is a big job title to say that I'm an archaeologist who specializes in care of archaeological objects and working with objects from Northwest Alaska. My family is Raramuri from northern Mexico, so from Chihuahua. So I am indigenous, but I am not, a North American native, not a tribally recognized person, which is fine. But I do bring the kind of family background of being an Indigenous person to my archaeological practice, even though I also do not work with my family's culture. I work primarily in Northwest Alaska, so pretty different. I'm really happy to be here. I'm happy to share what we've learned over a pretty difficult last, let's say, 50 years of trying to talk about centering Indigenous people in anthropology in a way that is productive and supportive rather than extractive and pretty terrible, which has been the general pathways for anthropology in the past. So yeah, I'm excited to talk to you all and learn from you all, and this is gonna be really fun.
Yay, thank you. And last but not least, Noel.
Hi there, my name is Noel Lopez. I am here in Virginia. I already heard both the Piscataways and Nacotchings called out, but I want to remind everyone to follow up with what Miranda said. All the lands that we're on, no matter where we are native lands, and we should always remember that and do our best to bring that always to the front when we're talking about where we are, or the forefront. I am a tribal liaison and anthropologist with the National Park Service here in the National Capital Region. A lot of my work centers around understanding communities and their usage of our cultural resources and natural resources in our parks, but also providing a platform for parks and for tribal nations to communicate back and forth, and helping my best to sort of assist in those communications and open pathways to dialogue. My background, I sometimes refer to myself as Afro-Mestizo. On my mother's side, they're Afro-Cubans from Cuba, obviously. And on my father's side, they are, my father's Mexican, and the family sort of originates from the Oromi tribes that were part of central Mexico. And I'm excited to be here with everyone. I'm excited to share, but I'm really willing and happy to learn from everyone who's here.
Thank you, Noel. And our last panelist who just joined us here today is Cinnamon. I'm glad that you were able to join and hop on. Beautiful.
Apologies, Central Time Zone snafu here. I'm coming to you from Springfield, Illinois. My name is Cinnamon Catler-Gutco. I'm the director of the Illinois State Museum, the ancestral lands of the Kickapoo and Peoria Nations. And I also like to always acknowledge the more than 100,000 Indigenous people who call Illinois home. So I'm glad to be with you, and I will catch up as we move along.
Yes, thank you. And you're right on time. You're right on time. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump in and also correct myself. I'm on Dena'ina land. I'm sorry to not get that clear. Just have a lot of different moving parts. So just to be 100% clear, that's where I am. And so I'm going to go ahead and begin by asking each panelist questions. And if you have any questions yourself, please feel free to put them in the chat. But for now, I'm going to start with Heather by asking, what are the histories or policies that you believe influence Indigenous people's access to and space in historic house museums?
That's a big question. So, wow, what policies? I think looking at it from a historical point of view, there have been so many policies that have shaped how Native nations live, where we live, how we, were we citizens, were we not citizens? If we're citizens, do we get to vote? I think there's just been so many policies from the beginning. When I talk about federal Indian policy, I tend to talk about it in terms of starting in 1830 with Indian removal signed by everyone's favorite president, Andrew Jackson. And so, and just removing Native people from their homelands, and removing us from our homelands removed us from part of our history. And a lot of these, cultural institutions that we work with are located, on our ancestral lands. I know, for example, in my work here with Stockbridge Munsee, we have historic lands here in Wisconsin, but everything we have is out east. It's along the Mahicanatuck, it's in the Berkshires in Massachusetts, and it's Vermont, Connecticut. I mean, when we consult on things and we're working on things, we're working in 6 different states. That's really a lot of work. But we managed to somehow get it done. And one of the things that I'm really excited about is, with the cultural and educational institutions that are located on our ancestral lands, reaching out to us and talking to us and saying, hey, what can we do to make this right? I've done a lot of work with institutions with land acknowledgements and, how to cultivate them in a way that's meaningful, it's genuine, that, there's action, there's contemporary history in them. It's so important to make sure we have that. In terms of policies, federal policies besides, removal and allotment and citizenship and all of those fun things that I could talk for hours about, we kind of got a win, in quotes, in 1990 with the passage of Nagpra. And I say quotes because we know Nagpra, Native American Graves Protection Act, Repatriation Protection Act, there's work that still needs to be done within Nagpra. There's a lot of things in the law that while it does give us some help in working with historic homes or museums to bring home items of cultural significance, and definitely to get ancestors off the shelves of those facilities, because ancestors do not belong on shelves in museums. They belong buried in the ground properly and respectfully. Nagpra is still flawed in the fact that the burden of proof lies on the Native nation. Like, how is that? That shouldn't be a thing. Nagpra also only applies to federally recognized states. And if you're not familiar, we have federally recognized, we have state recognized, and then we have tribes that are not recognized at all. And there's a whole bureaucratic tape that you have to get through to do all of that. So it doesn't even apply to every Native nation in the United States. And it doesn't apply to our objects that are outside of the country. And there are a lot of objects of ours outside of the country. So while it does help us in some ways, it's still fundamentally flawed. And I would hope that at some point that's something that we can look into to fix those flaws, to fix those loopholes, to make sure that it applies across the board the same way to every nation, so that every nation who is working with an historical home or a museum has those opportunities to, bring items home, bring ancestors home, and hopefully it gets the ball rolling. I mean, I would love to see some work done on Nagpra that would fix those loopholes. It's I feel like I talk about that a lot, and so that might eventually end up being a cause that I take up full time. So Washington will get really tired of seeing me if I ever do that.
Never. Okay. Thank you, Heather. Yes, so much. Yes. Cinnamon, how has institutional leadership failed when working with Indigenous peoples and histories? How have they succeeded? And are there any examples that you draw from?
Well, that's a great question, because sadly, I think the failure is more prevalent. Institutional leadership in general tends to segment itself from the front line, the content delivery, the heart of what happens in a museum so often. And that's where harm is caused most often, in terms of how information is delivered or exhibitions are installed, or the laundry list of things that museums do. So often they're segmented from that purposefully. And I think that's the #1 failure. Leadership really needs to work collaboratively at all levels, across all levels, and externally with Indigenous communities, and follow diplomatic channels of communication and relationship building. That's been a big element of my commitment as a leader. Prior to my time at the Illinois State Museum, I was at the Abbey Museum in Bar Harbor, Maine, which is a museum solely focused on the stories of Wabanaki people. And so to imagine sitting in that leadership role and not working collaboratively at all levels would have been powerful harm. So extending that to a state museum, it still counts. So I think that's number one. I think number two is the cohesion, the collaboration of the museum and the academic. Academia has been afforded a higher privilege and is often the source direction that leadership follows. And as a result, there's a complete detachment from Indigenous experience, past, present, and futures, so that leaders in power don't afford themselves the time to think about it through lived experience, to hear lived experience, to understand that there are multiple ways of knowing about the past. And whether that's a deliberate decision leaders have made or it's because of the nature of their work, it still needs to find a way to be part of their dashboard, their radar, their personal development. And then third, I think the way that leadership has failed is that leaders don't often engage in the professional development they're asking others to engage in. They need to be in lockstep with their colleagues. They need to be seen to be learning together. They need to consent to learn in public and in front of people who support to them, as well as with their peers. I often talk about the fact that in these rooms of professional development that I've been around diversity, inclusion, and decolonizing practice, I am the only leader ever there. That doesn't mean I'm an extraordinary little unicorn, but it's important to note that these rooms aren't seeing leaders show up in them, and there's something to be concerned there. Where they have succeeded, I don't think I have a lot of examples, to tell you the truth, when it comes to leadership. The worlds of education have really been at the forefront in museum spaces. Curatorial is starting to turn its head. Collections care is starting to turn its head and work collaboratively with Indigenous communities. But leaders are lagging behind. But when it does work well, I will say my previous employer is one great example, because when I moved to my next role, the board had already transitioned to majority Indigenous and made a commitment to really rethink what leadership is at a museum, renamed it from president and CEO to executive director and senior partner to Wabanaki Nations, and hired an Indigenous leader, right? So you don't see that happening in non-tribal museums. I don't think I've seen another example of it yet. So it's something to watch. All of us can get out our scorecards and watch for it.
100%. And I forgot to mention, I work for the Field Museum of Natural History, where I am constantly beating on that drum of leadership needing to do the work that they're asking the natives that they hire to do the work, and actually hold themselves accountable as well. So Cinnamon, thank you for your work. It is much appreciated, and your voice. Meghanlata, ready. How do you describe national public awareness regarding Indigenous peoples? How can historic house museums facilitate or improve this relationship?
Thank you. Another another big question, but I'm excited to answer. I think the way that I would start to frame it is actually comes from something I talk about in my senior thesis that I'm writing currently this week. But the New York Times reported on the Washington football team's name change over the last summer. And one article that came out examined the Americans exhibit at the National Museum of the American Indian. And the title of the article was called Seeing Native Americans Everywhere and Nowhere, or Nowhere and Everywhere. And really was meant to kind of show this, this paradox that, Native people, we've been featured on everything from sports teams logos to the front of butter packages, to a bunch of different things in societies, in film and media, Wild West. We see all these tropes and caricatures of who we are, yet our contemporary lives and experiences go largely unacknowledged and unnoticed by American society, mainstream American society. And that was, just a framing that really stuck with me. And it really does, I think, describe, national public awareness about Indigenous people. I do think that there are a lot of strides that we're making, and I'm extremely inspired by a lot of the movements that leaders across Indian country are engaged in, that we are all engaged in, to really be pushing back against narratives about who we are, stereotypes, that we don't exist anymore, that we're all the same, these really simplistic narratives. And so I think there are a lot of wonderful, very, impassioned efforts going on in Indian country to do so. And so I want to really emphasize that. And at the same time, I think we're still dealing with stereotypes and misconceptions and problematic narratives about who we are. And in my own work, which is, very tied to journalism, I mean, people, often don't really think about journalism as, well, we should be thinking about journalism as a very, it's not a neutral space. And for centuries, American journalism has been involved with the oppression of Native people in the way that news stories frame Native people, the way that we were described in the news. And that continues today. Maybe it's not, stories about, the frontier or things that newspapers had covered in, the 19th century. But it's still kind of the same kind of themes. And if it is, if there is coverage of Native people, it's often very damage centered, or the, relying on, these stereotypes of us being poor, what a lot of Native journalists like to call like on the res stories, and really fail to show the complexity of our lives and experiences. And so I think, it's a difficult question. I think things are definitely improving. I'm really, we see land acknowledgements happening. We see, more broader, conversations about thinking about relationships to land. And at the same time, we still need more. We need tangible action. And I think one thing that I really want to see, I want to see a lot of things. But in spaces that I'm working with now and kind of areas that I am, is just more rigorous and comprehensive coverage of Native people in our media sources. This is not to say that we can't cover our struggles, because those are very important. We should always be, really amplifying what struggles we're working against. But it also means that we also talk about our successes and our beauty and, the skills and the persistence and survivance that is embedded within our communities that makes us who we are today, because otherwise the narrative about, our people really rings incomplete. And so I think that's something that I think is still an ongoing fight, is to really increase that comprehensive narrative. And it's really difficult when so many problematic narratives are still coming in from all different institutions and all different sides. But I am hopeful. And I think where I'm really hopeful is when I see Native news sites and, Native leaders and organizers and knowledge keepers and storytellers and everyone doing that work. And that's what I'm really proud of. I know I've been talking for, this is a long answer, but as for, historic house museums improving this relationship, I think there's obviously a large variety of ways to do so. I think there's a lot of different ways to be an ally meaningfully. I think a huge part of it is education. And I think that comes with educating yourself as an individual, which is always the first step, educating those around you. This kind of work starts at home. It starts at, the dinner table. It starts at calling something out when you see it so that someone Native does not have to. And so I think there's this aspect of education, there's this aspect of acknowledgement, of recognition. And also I want to push us to think as well, in addition to this, tangible action as well, and what that means for redistributing resources, whether that's time, money, whatever that looks like. Maybe seeing what local grassroots organizers are doing, what maybe local nations are, working on in their own kind of cultural and educational institutions, and maybe not starting something new, but asking like, how can I distribute my time and my labor towards empowering you and towards amplifying you, and joining in solidarity with you. And so I think that to me is something I always see really powerfully, is having that partnership. And I think everyone is very like quick maybe to start something new, or like, start up something new, but there's so many people who've been working on these things for decades, for longer than decades. And when we all join kind of together, and we have that redistribution of labor, it can be really powerful.
Amen. Yes, of course. And one thing, and as I see in the chat before moving on, is this idea of education, which is what it all starts with, not just with our teachers, but we need to re-educate all Americans in this country need to be re-educated on some level of the true history of this nation and what it actually represented at the time of its founding as a nation. And a shameless plug, because I just want to emphasize, I'm asking some of these questions and giving questions to audience as a part of a TEDx talk I'm giving on Saturday for Northwestern on how you and American people can be better allies within these spaces for us. And so these are conversations that are continuously happening and don't end just here. So I'm gonna go ahead and move on to Annalisa. What can historic house museums learn from anthropology museums? What methodologies do you use in anthropological practices to make space for Indigenous peoples that can apply to historic houses and museums?
So I'm going to actually go really, really big picture here and say that the one thing that historic house museums can really learn from anthropology museums is in one of our biggest failures, which is that anthropology museums have been really resistant to the idea of finding a way to center Indigenous people, to decolonize. And I think the thing that other related disciplines can really benefit from looking at us is to say, oh, we don't have to be resistant to this, because we've now had a little bit of time to have some really stunning examples of what decolonial praxis looks like in anthropology museums. So the kind of go-to that I always look towards is the San Diego Museum of Us and their decolonial pathways policy, their decolonial initiatives, and anthropologists are, and archaeologists too, are slow to want to make these changes. And they are, it can be pulling teeth to get people to think differently about the discipline. But what happens when you do is a really wonderful, enlightening experience where you actually get a bigger picture of humanity and you get to know people really profoundly. And the only way that that happens is when anthropologists and archaeologists have actually stepped back and say, oh, I'm actually not the expert in this. To absolutely rip off the Museum of Us once again, they have a article that came out that was called Seeding Authority, Seeding Knowledge. So seeding, C-E-D-E, comma, seeding as in growing knowledge, and just letting go. There is room to still take what you've learned as an anthropologist or a historian or a, I don't know, fancy house specialist. I'm sorry. I don't know what that's called. Architectural historian, or like, you can still have that knowledge and that knowledge can still be valuable. But what's best is when you just go, oh, I don't actually know this part. And what I'm here to do is to give you space to speak for yourself, give you the tools that I've learned when I become an archaeologist to talk about your past. So anthropology, archaeology right now are at its best really in the middle of wrestling with kind of these big questions about what our discipline actually is. And so I would say to the historic house industry discipline to just jump in. Like, just do it, meet it with joy, understand that you're going to have hard conversations, but if you approach those conversations not from a place of being punished, which a lot of times anthropologists, honestly, archaeologists, we act like we're being punished when we're asked to consider other people. It's not a punishment, right? Like, it's not. It's a good thing to be like, to be a better relative, to be a better friend, to be a better neighbor. Just like lean into it, like let it go, like get excited about bringing your friends along, like and be excited about the time that it takes to build relationships. So you might have to do a little bit of like shifting what your metrics are that make you important in your arena, to better reflect the time that it takes to build the relationships that you need to have good trust between yourself and a Native community, to have good actual real friendships between yourself and Native community. So I think those things are there. As far as like actual methods that anthropologists use to center Indigenous voices, we don't do that very well. So I will say, I don't know if anthropologists are the best to ask that question to. I know that the only method that I really could say time and time again actually works is be a good friend. Like not just a good professional person, not just a good archaeologist, not just a good museums professional, like be somebody who your collaborators with can trust. I also think that in a more concrete way, moving towards a model of co-curatorial worlds is better, and kind of reconfiguring again what being a curator actually means. A lot of archaeologists find themselves in curatorial positions in museums, and traditionally that model is top down. There is an archaeologist who is an expert in an area. The exhibit, the programming that you experience from that exhibit comes from the archaeologist. And I think something that we do at the Hafenreffer well, and when we do it well, we do it well, is making sure that our exhibits are co-curated. So when I first started, there was an exhibit on that was, is actually two exhibits. One was on, it was called Drone Warriors, and it was about the use of drones at Standing Rock. And then the other was called Sacred is Sacred, which was about the art for the protection of bears' ears. And both of those were curated by, one was Adrienne Keen, so faculty at Brown. The other was Isabella Robbins, who was a grad student at Brown at the time. And both of those are Native women who had the opportunity to come to the Hafenreffer, use us as a resource for how to build an exhibit, and then put the exhibit on, rather than an academic curator sitting back and going, what do I want to tell people about? So I think that kind of moving towards a curator as a facilitator, curator as a relationship builder is a really good thing that we can all build from. And I think the other thing that house museums can take that is a good piece of advice that I wish anthropologists would take more often too, is just recognizing that, like, it doesn't matter if there's not a direct connection to an Indigenous person that you can find in a historical record. Your house museum, your anthropology museum had an interaction with Native people. It absolutely did. There's no way it didn't. Just by the virtue of the land that it's on, you have an interaction with Native people. In my grandmother's culture, we don't separate people from land, right? So if you are on Rarmuri land, you have met a Rarmuri person, right? And I think that many Indigenous people view their lands that way. And it's important to know that, like, it doesn't matter if you don't have like that perfect one-to-one connection, like you have that. So you have a responsibility to build a relationship with everyone else. So the summary is co-curatorial models, I think, are great. Spending time building relationships and just letting go and knowing that what will come out of the let go is something way cooler and more beautiful than you probably imagined from the beginning. So yeah.
Thank you, Annalisa. And I appreciate that coming from your perspective, and thinking about one thing, a way I think I would have reframed this question before starting was having to understand the real harm, though, anthropology has done to Native groups, and to ask of why are there anthropology museums in the first place, like the Field Museum, and understanding that they were created for the idea of white society being able to look at us and say, they vanished, we got rid of them, and here is how they should be learned about. And so for me, when we talk about like friendship as praxis and things like that, it's about having to understand that with that reality of vanishing there's a lot of rectifying that has to be done, and a lot of looking at oneself in the mirror, especially as someone who might have white privilege, and really being able to say, how can I show up for these people? Because anthropology can be very extractive, more than I think people fully understand. So, and there's much more discussion that I wish we had more time to go into depth about that, because I think it goes into some of the questions we're being asked as well. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward with Noel and ask, how can historic house museums and other institutions in DC better incorporate regional tribal histories and collaborate with Indigenous peoples?
Thank you very much. That's a great question, and also a very big question, a difficult one. I think you know, a lot of the work is easier than people realize. It's just doing it. I think that there's a lot of excuses as to why we can't do the work, but when you get down to it, there's communities that are living, that exist in your area, that you can easily find out about, and you need to go to those people directly and work with them in developing relationships. This is all, the work is relationship building. It's a question of reaching out and sometimes being humble and saying, you know, we made a mistake, we messed up. Sometimes actually the humbleness is step one in actually establishing a good relationship. One of the big problems we have on top of that is there have been a lot of efforts that have probably happened in the past. I think we sometimes have a short memory. You know, I like to say that when you work with tribal communities, they have a long memory, and institutions have extremely short ones. In another life, I was a school teacher, and I remember once one of the older teachers telling me, "Oh, we used to do that thing 10 years ago, and then we flipped it and started doing it differently, and we started doing it again this one way." Institutions often vacillate between two different extremes, and there have probably been moments in the past where they've engaged with these communities that are in their area, and then they've changed policy and decided to take a different direction, and then go back to the same people and say, "Hey, we want to work with you all over again, or we want to work with you as if it's square one." And people are like, "You've done this before, you've come to us before, you've committed to do something with us before, and you've forgotten about this thing that you promised us once." So I think one of the most important things is developing the relationship, recording what people tell you, like listening to what people say directly. Oftentimes, people may communicate, you know, institutions have a hard time listening to the way that people who communicate differently than they do communicate. And so oftentimes people will say directly, "We were wronged once in XYZ way." You may dismiss that thing that they say to your own peril, because there's truth in what they say, regardless of it being the way that you understand the information or not. I've had that experience before where I had some elders in Maryland tell me that something had happened years ago, and there was no proof anywhere. There's no evidence in anything. You know, in all the traditional places you'd look, like the archaeological resource studies that we had, or the AOAs, there was nothing in there. There was nothing in in any historical document that we had written, any of our administrative histories, in none of those things. But there was an elder who said, "We were wronged once." And instead of taking them maybe as being wrong, we listened to them directly and said, "Okay, they're communicating something here. Let's actually dig into this." And that elder was 100% right as to the desecration that occurred and what that was. And I think it's very easy to dismiss things that people say. I think it's very easy to sort of be more overly concerned with taking minutes and making sure that a meeting runs a very specific way, and then getting to an end of something. I think what's very difficult is sometimes, you know, you have a well-paying job, you have this great position, you have a great title, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes just humbling yourself and saying, everyone here who's here has an equal voice. and I should be listening to what everyone says because it actually has value. And when you come down to it, again, I say for the Park Service, people stick in a position for maybe 3 to 5 years and then they leave. But those communities that you work with will be there far beyond my position and the time that I've gotten in working for the government. And so by not centering in their voices, by not listening, you're doing the wrong thing. The way that you get to it, especially when you're talking locally, is to find out who's in your community, who are the people that you need to speak with, and make sure that if you're a federal institution, there's very specific protocol that you should follow when it comes to sort of nation-to-nation discourse and dialogue. But no matter what, respectfully, reach out to the correct people. There's, you can look at, I'll probably put in the chat some information as to places you can look up who are the tribal leaders for the federally and state and federal recognized tribes. When it comes to unrecognized tribes, it's a little more difficult, but you should work with the tribal communities there as well to figure out who that is. And then just do the hard work, figure out what the protocol is, make sure that you're respectful all the time. Don't try to change it up on people just because you think that they don't have a government that suits what you think the way the government should function. Doesn't mean anything at all. It has nothing to do with you. And these relationships have been established previously through these processes. So you need to come at people with respect at all times. And then when it comes down to it, it's just do the work. Like, we were just having the conversation about land acknowledgements. I was mentioning earlier that I'm of two minds. I think it's important for everyone to do the land acknowledgement, but I think more importantly is for it not to be hollow. And so for land acknowledgement not to be hollow means developing it directly with tribal groups, tribal communities, tribal leadership. And if you are acknowledging, if you have a museum, a house, whatever it is, and you're doing an acknowledgement by simply looking something up, you're doing it wrong. That means that you could be acknowledging someone who has, names and groups and other things that maybe even be wrong and you don't even know it, that may be contested and you don't know. So if it's not built around living people who are going to tell you directly what they think and what they feel and the way they want to be represented, you're doing it wrong. And I think in an age of things like white fragility and all those sort of performative books, it's best not to do it wrong. It's best to do it for meaningful and purposeful reasons that are directly engaging people who can correct you and can slap your hand if you ever mess up. And if you're not talking to people, stop and find someone to talk to. I think that's pretty much it.
100%, Noel, yes. And one thing that kept popping up when you were talking for me was before you even talk to any tribe, make sure your institution is ready to do the work that it means to work with a tribe. Meaning, have you, when it's going back to all the discussions that were here already said, have you gotten to know your history? Have you gotten to know the land that the house, that the museum is on and that history? Have you gotten to know how people were removed from these places, how you have benefited from the removal of Indigenous people, and being able to you're gonna have to compensate people for their time, while you're gonna have to be able to make space for them on the board, at the seat at the table. There's a lot that goes into that foundational work of an institution before you approach tribes and ask them to come and do work for whatever it is that you might need them for. Because a lot of times institutions need us, and as much as we need access to them, unless they're going to be receptacle, they won't be here for us. So yes, Noel.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that everyone got to this point, which is that a lot of the relationship is exploitive always. And, and I think that's a major problem with anthropology. It's a major problem with the work that we do. Is that we want to go out there and take from someone and then give them no credit, no nothing, but we benefit from it. We benefit as an institution by bringing people in. We benefit as individuals by, putting our name up further up, on sort of like glorifying ourselves. But the people whose stories are, in the same way that the land is taken and then we build all this stuff on the land, the stories are taken and we build our careers and everything on those stories. And you have to stop that exploitive process to really get down to what needs to be done.
Is there anyone of other panelists who would like to add on to that, or Annalisa?
Yeah, I just wanted to say real quick that, you know, what I didn't mention and I should have is that, like, you can't be a good friend unless you are able to acknowledge your harm, right? Like, you have to be the kind of person or institution that is willing to say, like, oh, this is how we have messed up in the past. And one of the things that I think the Museum of Us does really well is just goes through its history and is like, and this is the bad point, and this is the bad point, and this is the bad point. And that kind of like truth telling is a good like start point. But I do think that a lot of especially anthropologists get caught up in that start point. If they're willing to acknowledge it at all, that's kind of where they stop, is that, oh, we were bad. We're a very bad discipline and we'll never get better. So I guess we're just bad. What are we going to do? I guess we're terrible. So sorry, we're awful. We've been awful in the past. I guess we're terrible. And you're like, yeah, okay, but what next? And so I think that's when you can really start growing relationships and growing, like, you got to start with honesty first, just like you would start with honesty with anybody that you're like pursuing a real friendship, a real relationship with. So I didn't get a chance to say that, and I just wanted to make sure that I did.
Can I add on to that real quick? Oh, Heather.
Sure. How about we'll use the raise hand feature if y'all can.
Oh, perfect. Okay, cool. I was just going to second Annalisa in saying, I think in my like collaborations with like non-native institutions or groups or like even like individual people, I think what has been really impactful for me is the fact that we are all going to make mistakes at some point in our lives. Like we are all going to be engaged in a lifelong process of learning and unlearning. I know, I mean, for me as a non-Black person, that's a process that I need to be deeply committed to my whole life. And that I know that I'm not going to be perfect all the time, but I think it's like like Annalisa was saying, the ways in which you kind of engage with that with yourself and hold yourself accountable and not, you know, that doesn't mean, I think it's like people's reaction or, you know, people be like, I'm scared of saying something wrong, or I'm, you know, I don't want to engage because of this, but it's like, I would rather, you know, maybe something happened, but, you know, walk away feeling like, okay, you learned, you're committed, than someone who, you know, just like takes feedback really poorly. And I think that's a big part of it, is like how you react to being called in or just, you know, having a difficult conversation, because these conversations like are difficult. Like that's the difficult part of them, is that there are times when it can be very tense and very sensitive. It's not, you know, always, you know, always like not that way because of the complexities and the violence in our community's histories that we need to grapple with. So just wanted to second what Annalisa was saying.
Cinnamon.
I was just going to add, which ties a little bit of a through line from what I was saying earlier to what has been said since, is that the key to this work is to promote transparency as well. That to do it in isolation, to do it in a void, to not openly share the messiness, the bumps, is a real hazard. You can gain a lot of traction by learning from others when you open up and show what your work is about. And I think that's another one of the obstacles that leadership avoids, is they want to have it perfect before they show the world. And that is an incredibly problematic thinking system, because it doesn't exist. And what you learn will change every day. What you do through a program will change the next time. What you do with an initiative will change daily with who you're connecting with as you begin to collaborate and center Indigenous voices. So I think that's a critical thing. And I was so fortunate early on in my career around decolonizing work to learn from Darren Ranko, who's a Penobscot scholar, anthropologist at University of Maine, who really said to me early on, because I'm a museum leader. I want all the details. I want to have it figured out. I need timelines. I need all these things. And he understood that that was one of my hang-ups. But he said to me early on, as you do this work, do it in a way that is useful to all tribal communities, not just who we are and who we're working with. Make it wildly accessible. And that's where you start to move into the world of practice, right? we can talk about this, but we don't have a lot of practice to show for the work still. And I think that causes us to hang up a little bit as we move along, and why transparency is so critical so the practice can be seen.
110%. Heather, did you want to say something?
I did, and I forgot what I was originally going to say because now I've got other thoughts running in my head. But what I wanted to say in terms of, what Noel was saying and Annalisa and Meghanlata were also saying is it's important to acknowledge that deep, dark history that nobody wants to talk about because it makes you uncomfortable. And it makes you uncomfortable for a reason, because it was wrong. When I do land acknowledgement, when I talk with people about land acknowledgements, I flat out tell people, I'm like, do not shy away from using those harsh words: stolen land, unceded territory, appropriation, genocide. Like, that happened. And it's important to acknowledge that. The moment we have acknowledgement of that, healing can begin, unlearning can begin, and you can continue to go forward and tell a bigger and better, fuller and more inclusive history of the land that your facility is on. But then inside of your facility as well, you can have those more inclusive histories. It's so important. And everybody's always like, oh, it makes me uncomfortable to talk about this. Well, you know what? I'm pretty sure my ancestors were uncomfortable living it. So you can talk about it. It's not a bad thing. And understanding that idea of that emotional and generational trauma that continues to pass down, it's real. And so you've got to make sure that you're taking time to know your stuff before you come to us, because it's not my job to tell you our history. When we carry computers in our hands every day, you can easily start to Google something, look at, scholarly sources. Come prepared when you're coming to us. Don't have us all do the work. I'm tired, okay? I do this work every day. I'm tired. You can do some of it. So it's so important to know that before you're coming to the nations, and to understand it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be pretty, and you're going to feel uncomfortable, and that's okay. We're going to get past that part, and we're going to move forward. That's all I wanted to say.
Oh, that's it?
That's it. Go on if you want, but I don't want to hog all the time.
No, and I'm going to, Meghanlata, I'm going to go ahead and pass it to you really quick, and then kind of shift the conversation that is to fit into discuss some of the questions we're being asked.
Yeah, very, very quickly. And Heather, that was so beautiful. So thank you. What Heather was saying reminded me of Amy Lonetree's work on decolonizing museums, and what she really drives home is like in museums, it's important to be telling, kind of acknowledging the painful aspects of colonization, showing and having people who are coming to museums having to confront that, like in conversation along with the stories of our survival and our persistence and, our power. And so I think it's a really difficult kind of balance, but exactly, speaking to what Heather was saying is that, this can be true of museums. This can also be true of historic houses. This can be true of any institution, but it's an incomplete story to, not confront that violent history. Yes, I think our collaborations can be incredible, and we can talk a lot about, our contemporary experiences and everything, and, join together, but also there has to be that really, really meaningful reckoning with the history of colonization and with this history of violence, which can be very, very, emotional, but it's very necessary if we are to do that healing.
Yes, 100%. And to kind of go off of that and to address some things that are coming up in the chat, as well as someone had asked, is there good co-curation examples and collaborative examples that are out there? I was co-curator for Apsalaga Women and Warriors at the Field Museum. Apsalaga are the Field Museum, Crow tribe in Montana, where we had a community curator come in. She speaks Crow, she's from the reservation. And every aspect to that exhibition was a fight over the name, over how something should be displayed. We had tribal elders say, yes, please write letters, trying to get the Field Museum to understand why things needed to be out in a certain way, or why they should be honored in a certain way. And the one thing that keeps coming back to me on this work is, you know, museums are often, yes, I understand museum people may be uncomfortable saying these things out loud, but they weren't uncomfortable when they stole our human remains and they stole our ancestors. There's 3,000 human remains at the Field Museum from across the world who are Indigenous. There are hundreds of ancestors that were taken from us under duress. Even if they weren't stolen, we had to sell them for meager amounts of money to survive. And so, and when visitors don't want to see it, I often ask, why? Is it because it's disrupting your perception of the view that you have of the country that you live in? Because I live in a very different country than what a white visitor might live in for themselves from the suburbs. To me, we had to get these institutions to see how they produce the harm for the world that we're living in today, how they created stereotypes, how they created horrible discrimination practices within the confines of their museums or houses or archives, and how they perpetuated that for generations. And tell people, like their visitors, this is what we did, why we were wrong, and what we're doing to move forward. And to give back our island, to give back, well, give back Turtle Island, but also to return our human remains, as you've never needed them to begin with. There's a lot of nuances that go into this work that this is just scratching the surfaces for which we are discussing here today. And so to go and talk more, I'm going to just go and ask everyone else, is there a project that you are well familiar with that you think does this work well? Yes, Annalisa.
I have one, and I'd like to not call out, but draw attention to the work of Leah Hopkins at the Haffenreffer Museum. And she responded awesomely during the pandemic and kind of shifted some of the work that she was doing with the education department to bring Narragansett and New England Native voices to the forefront at the Haffenreffer to build an amazing online module called This Land is Home that looks at the seasonal round of Native New England in the past and contemporarily. And I can put the link in the chat. It's amazing work. And I think it's a really great example of what happens when a museum invests the time in bringing someone from a community to their space to do the work. Leah is a staff member at the Haffenreffer, and also is a great example of something that you can do now by hiring somebody from the community to do the work and to build a project. You can do it now. So I just wanted to really acknowledge the work that she did for that. And yeah, I think Leah's here, so she did amazing work. And yeah, I love that project so much.
Anyone else?
I'm happy to share a project briefly. While I was at the Abbey Museum, we had the opportunity to really rethink our entire exhibits program. There hadn't been a permanent or core exhibit for a long list of reasons, but it was definitely time to rethink the entire program. So we took, in the end, I think the count was almost 4 years to go from interpretive planning process that was fully collaborative with the Native Advisory Council, as well as community members across the Indigenous communities in Maine, to really determine the themes we needed to talk about, how we were going to do this work. And then moving into the exhibition process, it was highly collaborative in the sense that the curator of collections became the facilitator, who was the staff member, who worked with over 30 Wabanaki folks to do this exhibit, as well as 4 Wabanaki artists to design the exhibit. And the result was incredibly transformational. It's an exhibit like I've never seen. It was not artifact driven. It's first person perspective. It centers Indigenous worldview and perspective. It welcomes people to the homeland. And it really asks you to consider the land that you're on and the people who have been there for more than 12,000 years. And the other key to this was we knew that through this collaborative work, we're going to still get some things wrong. And we had a willingness to change labels, a very simple thing. I said this earlier in a conversation that you can change labels fast. It doesn't matter what people tell you, you actually can. So when you learn something, change it. And so we had that commitment to really be transformational as we learned. It continues today. I'll put a link in the chat, but it now centers the conversations we add to. So like temporary exhibits build off of that conversation and follow the same model that's collaborative, privileges Indigenous voice and perspective, and commits to truth telling. We really studied the work of Amy Lone Tree. I continue to study her work and find her writings incredibly useful when you start to rethink the museum model.
Yes, Heather.
Yeah, just really quick too. I'm gonna have a little bit of me moment and plug that I'm actually working with the Berkshire Museum in Massachusetts to do an exhibit on the Stockbridge Munsee, because who better to tell the history of the people than an actual Mohican? So it's, it was awesome. They had this idea for an exhibition, but they didn't know how to execute it, and so they were responsible in their thinking of reaching out to the community members and saying, hey, how can we do this? And so I'm very excited to work with them and help them. And actually it's kind of been like a learning process when we've had our meetings with them. We did land acknowledgement workshops. They're learning Mohican language as we're doing it, because it's going to be a bilingual exhibit, which is really cool to have that Mohican language, which has been asleep for so long, on our Mohican lands again. So it's really exciting to be able to work with them and collaborate with them. And it just goes to show any museum or historic house can do it, as long as you just reach out to the nation and ask them for their help. We'll help you. We totally will help you. We won't do all the work for you, but we will help you do it. And so I'm really excited about that. And that opens in August. So I'm really happy about that collaboration.
Congratulations, yay. And that makes me want to ask you all, going into, can you all, how does an interpreter, if at all, represent a culture that isn't their own? And then how do we compensate people properly?
You just do it. I mean, think about it. Who's going to be a better storyteller of that Indigenous history than an Indigenous person? Do you know what I mean? Like, that just kind of makes sense. Like, I am not an expert in Latinx history, or which I should be, because I do have some ancestry in my background, so I'll work on that. But like, I wouldn't be able to do an exhibit on something in Asian history or Black history, because that's not me. I'm not that expert. And while I'm not an expert, so to speak, in Indigenous history as well, you want to reach out. I mean, when we're doing things in our facility, and I am a tribal museum, so when I'm doing things and we want to talk about maybe one of the other tribes in our area, I'm not an expert on Ojibwe history or Menominee history. I'm going to go to the source. So you just have to go to the source. And as Noel pointed out earlier, there is, proper protocol to go through. You want to know the tribal leadership. You want to understand that. And even in, you want to educate yourself, because sometimes, a lot of Native nations in our history, in our tradition, in our culture, storytelling happens in the winter time, and there's reasons behind that. And so you just want to be mindful when you're entering into that relationship and asking that institution to help you out, or that group to help you out. And then, obviously compensation is important. I don't talk numbers. You work that out with the person that you're working with, but it's key. It's absolutely key, because so much has been taken historically. It's time to give back. So again, it's just reaching out. And even as a tribal museum, again, I don't know Menominee history that well. I don't know Ojibwe history that well, Ho-Chunk, whatever. I'm going to go to the source. So if I, as a tribal museum, can go to the source, you as a non-tribal museum or a non-tribal historic home can also go to the source.
Amen. Noel?
Yeah, I was just going to say, as far as when it comes to paying people, subcontract. Like, you pay for contractors. If you're working with elders, you communicate with them, or you communicate with leadership, and you say, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to put money into a pot over here that goes directly to the tribe? Do you want me to just compensate directly to the people that are speaking about their history? I think, you just treat them as you would any other expert. You wouldn't expect, like, you wouldn't go to a university and be like, oh, we need an archaeologist here and we want them to do it for free, even though they know this stuff, and you would hire them on as a contractor or subcontractor. I think, the workaround that I've found is to hire people on as subcontractors on agreements and on contracts. And it's surprising how easy it is. They just fill out, like, I think a 1099. You send them money, the way that you would with anything else. It's great to have good intentions, but it's better to put your money where your mouth is.
Annalisa?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, and another thing that anthropology museums don't do well a lot of times, and I'm gonna call out my bosses here a little bit, is don't build projects without the money for them. Don't build positions without the money for them. One of the things that leadership can do is figure out your budgets. Like, that's kind of operations 101 for being a leader in a museum space. And the project that I work on right now is funded by the National Park Service. One of the things that is, and I did not write my scope, I would not have written it this way, it does not include community outreach. So all of that depends on my relationships that I have built in the past. And that's fine. I'm happy to work with people that I'm friends with and work with, but, like, you have to have a budget, and you can't really do the work without building a budget. And if you're the director of a museum or the associate director of a museum, that you should know how to do is build a budget. So just like compensation is, just do it. Kind of like everybody else is saying, you just have to do it.
Yes, thank you. I want to go ahead and give everyone an opportunity before we end today, wrap it up, to say some last things that are in their head. Maybe there's something you really want to relay to the audience. And just, speak from the heart and let everyone know what else they can do moving forward to keep this conversation going within their own spaces. Whoever wants to go.
I'll just start, just to be quick. I think number one is to be open to being wrong, and just be understanding of the people you're talking with, and I don't know, just be humble. Like, just be humble and say, I don't know enough about this. Can you help me out? Ask people to help, and then also be okay with people being mad at you. Like, you can't expect after 500, 600 years now total, with Spanish at least, for you to just be like, oh, everything's gonna be great now, and sorry, we agreed to this one thing. People may forever have rancor towards you, and that's okay, and you need to deal with it, because that's just, that's the position, the way it is, and you just learn to work through it. But don't expect people to just be, happy, nice, or anything. So just show up to people with some humility, but be willing to put the hard work in. Thank
you. Annalisa?
There is a question that just popped up in the chat that I think is a good one, that kind of ties into some of this, which is, how do you begin to make connections happen if you don't already have them? And I think something that we can see through this panel is that all across the US, we got people from all over the place here, are active members of their tribal community that have events, that have public programs, that have days that are open to the public to come, that they have a large open community powwow, go to those. Not with the expectation of like having anything happen or that you're trying to network, but show up for your community and just start there. Even if it's like this, it takes a really long time, that slow building and just getting to know your neighbors is a really good start if you don't have a lot of resources. So one of the resources that you do have is time. So spend some of your time with the people that you want to make connections with.
Definitely. Okay, Cinnamon.
I would just say for me that what I haven't said yet that I think is critically important as a non-Indigenous white person, a settler on this land, that the work that I have to do is daily to relearn, unlearn, to dedicate myself on a path is critical to my success in this arena. I can't really let up on the gas at any point, and the moment I do, I start to mess up. And so the moment I know that, the better off I think my organization is, the better off I am, and the better off the folks I'm working with are. And I really prioritize harm reduction as my lodestar, if you will. What can I do now to remove harm? And I can't see that unless I'm doing the personal work. And so when I say that, and I get asked this all the time, what do I need to do to get started? Well, back to the theme of let's Google it first. But number two, really submitting yourself to formal education. I've had to completely unlearn my graduate program. I've had to move into really painful anti-racism workshops and bear myself to really understand my motivations and the coding that I walk with and work with, and really teach myself how to accept feedback, which is my greatest weakness. I'll confess it to all of you on here right now. I don't like it, but I have to take it. And I can only begin to be of use to anyone when I subject myself to that learning. So I encourage everyone on here to start now if you haven't started. And if you've let up, go ahead and put a little bit of gas back on it.
Thank you, Cinnamon. Thank you so much. All right, Meghanlata or Heather?
I can say something because I've said a lot so far. No, I wanted to say first, thank you for this panel. I have learned here too as well. And so I think that's awesome. And I think, this alludes to something that was said in the chat. You're going to have people who are going to want to not be part of it or turn their head or what have you. And I'm going to tell you that's okay, because those are the people that you don't want in your institution, because they're going to do a bad job relaying that history and talking about that when you're trying to create a more inclusive space. You're going to have visitors who are just going to snub their noses up at whatever you're trying to do. And you know what? That's okay too, because you don't want those people there. They're just going to cause a ruckus, and they've already closed their mind off to learning. And you're going to have tough conversations, and you're going to be uncomfortable, and it's going to get icky. And that's okay, because you're doing something that is going to change the face of your facility, and it's going to change it for the better. Indigenous history is so rich and so beautiful, and I'm going to cry. And we just want to share it, and we want to make sure that we haven't been forgotten, and we can't do it without you. So.
Thank you. Don't stop. No, show emotion. I think that's another thing we need to get comfortable with.
This is so unprofessional, but it happens sometimes. You can do the work. You can do it. We lived it. We're still living it. You can help us with it, and you can help get us out there. So that is all I wanted to say. And thank you.
Thank you. Meghanlata?
I don't know how I'm gonna follow that. I will just say, I'll tell a quick little, I promise a quick little story. But there was a wonderful exhibit here at Yale, Place, Nations, Generations, Beings, organized by wonderful groups of Indigenous students, and working with Yale with the art gallery. It was incredible. And one of the pieces in the exhibit is this tray, this birch bark tray that has quill work. It's absolutely wonderful. I wish I could show it to everyone right now. And the curators had written in the catalog that, you know, what's so special, I guess, about this tray is that it was made during it's an Ojibwe tray, obviously, not obviously, but and it was made during, probably made during a time within a mission or within a missionary period. And that, you know, European missionaries had allowed Indigenous people to continue with quill work specifically because it reminded them of the embroidery of European women. But the beautiful part about this is that if you look closely at the tray, you can see that the quill work is in the shape of a thunderbird and the 4 directions. And there's thunderbirds lining the side. There's the 4 directions in the middle. There's also, I feel like I can see a shape of a turtle as well. And it really grounds me, just this example of this tray, because it shows how our ancestors, they risked so much to pass down our stories and to ensure that we could know the beautiful, you know, values and you know, memories that our communities hold so dearly. And they were doing that, and they were thinking of us all throughout that time. And so I guess I just want to say that to really frame the stakes of this, that, you know, this is something that is so urgent. This is something that is so, you know, all encompassing. And whenever I think about that, I think about my own ancestors who are probably doing quill work, thinking about me one day being here. And, you know, I would just encourage, you know, allies to think about, you know, really what that means, you know, that really long held commitment to identity and homeland is just, it's like, I can't even put words to it. But that is what I think about when I think about, you know, what I want people to take away is how they can support that. And yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. Yes. And for me, being able to share space with so many wonderful people, thank you all of you all for being here. And one thing just to end off of the note that Meghanlata started was, you've heard us say numerous times, ancestors, ancestors, ancestors. And you might see those items as objects, as artifacts. We are referring to those items you see as an object, as an ancestor. And what that means is it's not just the human body. And it goes back to what Meghanlata was saying. Our ancestors and our way of life was embedded in us from time of creation, and the land and the animals and everything, and has been created in these items, in these ancestors, their dreams, their hopes, their ideas. And when we're able to gain access to a museum site or a collection site and reconnect with the things that our ancestors had to sell, had to part with, you're kind of bridging the gap between what people were trying to get rid of us and how we survived. Our ancestors are here with us at all times. And I firmly believe that when you do this work, it's healing our society as a whole. It's healing me, it's healing my future children, and it's healing those of us who are dedicated to trying to make this world a better place for the next generation. We might not be doing quill work right now. We may not be doing, for me, basketry, but we are creating and dreaming just the same way our ancestors did for the next generation, to hope that they are left with something better than we are today. And I hope that this panel was a great way for you all to see how personal and important that this work is. And it's not just a history, it's a way of life for many of us. So thank you all. I will go ahead and pass it off to Jerry. I want to say, yes, Jerry, for his last remarks.
Hello. I'd like to thank the panel for their meaningful insight tonight. I hope this discussion serves as a clarion call for all of us in the Historic House Museum field to nurture the partnerships and conversations that are clearly necessary to understand and tell the complete stories of Native peoples across this country. I'd also like to take the opportunity right now to thank programs intern Eliza Lafferty for creating and coordinating this amazing panel, and programs manager Mary Lesher for overseeing the event. It truly would not have gotten anywhere without the work of these two people. They're amazing, and happy to have them, ecstatic to have them on staff. A reminder, we will be sending out resources and donation opportunities to benefit an organization that supports Indigenous peoples following this event, along with a form to collect your feedback and a recording of tonight's conversation. So thank you again, and have a great night.